dyslexia is an intensely comorbid occurrence, which means that in my decades of doing what I do, I have never met a child who is only dyslexic. The most visible thing in the primary years might only be the difficulty in acquiring literacy. But there might be a whole range of other things which, if not taken care of, even a very good literacy intervention is not going to work.
Hi, I'm Farah Danish. Welcome to my Calm Autism Mom podcast. I'm a certified brain gym movement facilitator, former special educator, and a mindset coach. Through my podcast, I bring together parents, experts from educational, psychology, and medical communities to share innovative insights on parenting and supporting individuals on the spectrum. My mission is simple: to continuously learn and share the latest autism-related news and strategies, bringing you powerful conversations and practical solutions you can use right now. So, if you're an autism mom searching for answers, support, or just some real inspiration, you're in exactly the right place, my friend. Let's transform your autism parenting journey starting right now. Hello, Zara. Thank you so much for being here with me today. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for having me.
So, Zara, just for my moms over here who are listening to us, can you introduce yourself in terms of what you do and why you do what you do?
Okay. All right. Brilliant. So that's a good place to start. So I'm Zara. I head the Learning Support Department at the Developing Child Center here in Dubai. And I would say that we are a small enterprise. We're a social enterprise, and we support children across the entire range of neurodiversity, from moderate to high support needs. Now, why I do what I do, it's because I am the only neurotypical person in a large, loud, proud, out there neurodiverse family. Every person in our family, nuclear family, is neurodivergent. And yeah, I mean, I used to do something very different, but then I thought that the best thing to do would be to make this my calling. And yeah, it's been very fulfilling.
Thank you for sharing that. So, Zara, I want to first clarify what the purpose of this specific episode is. First of all, it is to identify and recognize basically the signs of dyslexia or any kind of reading difficulties that children have, specifically neurodiverse children, autistic children, because it's even more challenging to recognize those signs in a neurodiverse, well, they are all neurodiverse, in autistic children. And also, how can parents advocate for their kids in school? How can they support their children at home as well? So I know those are a lot of questions with heavy answers. So we'll start with, how can you recognize those signs? Like, what is a difference between a reading difficulty, a typical, which a neurotypical child might have, and what does dyslexia really look like?
The first thing that we have to understand is that dyslexia is a language and an auditory processing based learning difficulty. And if I may be allowed to use the word disorder, since we're talking about identification over here, I will use that. I know it's not a very inclusive term to use at the moment. So it's a speech and language based disorder. So the first thing that you're going to notice in the child in those very early stages of development is, we are talking about those pre-literacy acquisition stages between the ages of 1 and 3. It would be speech and language problems. So children who have a stammer, children who might have a tongue tie, children who have something which is called a word retrieval problem. And it's very cutesy when they're teeny tiny. They might know in context what word they're looking for, but the word that they're actually using is incorrect for that context. So a child wanted to tell me that I've got sparkly eyeshadow, but she ended up telling me that you have sprinkles on your eyes. So very similar words, but incorrect usage in the context. So those are the first. So these are the pre-literacy stages.
Okay.
I would say that between the ages of 1 to 4, when they're not yet acquiring skills of reading.
Okay. Okay.
So children who have speech and language difficulties in their early years are more susceptible to being dyslexic than children who
Mm.
don't. Children who dyslexia is highly genetic. The genetic
Oh,
linkages are very strong. So if you have dyslexia that is running in the family, then your child is obviously at a greater risk of having a dyslexic identification.
okay, because it's so common for me to hear things like, you have sparkly eyes, like you just mentioned, the example that you just gave. I'm just thinking about the times I've actually heard that and never suspected, and from kids between that age, 2 and 4, 2 and 5 as well. And that's a thought that's never crossed my mind, but that's really interesting. Can you give some more examples of what that would sound like for a child who you might suspect is, could be dyslexic?
So I think I need to caveat that over here. If this is the only atypical thing that is happening with the child's speech development, that does not
Hmm.
automatically mean that at the age of 7 they're going to be dyslexic. It's
Okay.
always a constellation of risk factors that is going to lead to a child having that identification.
Okay.
But the earliest thing that we can pinpoint are language and auditory processing difficulties.
Yeah.
So, language difficulties are the ones that I have just listed. Auditory processing difficulties are, sometimes you say, oh, this child is very sensitive to noise.
I was going to say that. Yeah.
I've got my AC is an older machine, so it's kind of loud.
Hmm.
So a child may get excessively, not necessarily annoyed, but be excessively aware of that noise. Those are auditory processing. Those are indicators of there being barriers with auditory processing. Another way to find out those barriers in the early years is that a child is not capable of retaining more than 2 or 3 pieces of auditory information in their short-term memory. So that what that might mean for a parent is that, can you please now tidy up your toys, go to the toilet and put your shoes on because we're going out. But the child is not able to retain those 3 pieces of information. So
Mm.
those are auditory processing difficulties that we see in the early years.
Right. So children like that, like you rightly pointed out, would have sensory integration issues as well, right? Is that common for them to exist at the
Very,
same?
very, very common. There's
Mm.
reflex integration within occupational therapy and sensory integration, the ATNR. So that thing of crossing the midline
Mm, mm,
like
mm, mm.
this. For children whose ATNR is not integrated, who cannot cross the midline,
Yeah.
dyslexia becomes a very high probability, because we sometimes see it as only the eyes tracking the letters. So the eye is going and map. It's not
Mm,
just the eyes that are crossing the midline when you blend three
mm,
sounds together. It's also happening in here with the motor planning of sounds. Your
mm.
brain is motor planning the sounds in a particular sequence and therefore crossing the midline to blend the word together.
Oh, wow. And so what are the steps the parents can do when they want to go into, when they want to help their children? They want to do evaluations for their children. Like, what should be the first step? Like, check for sensory integration, check for, like, how should they start the process of helping their children?
We're talking about specifically helping children with dyslexic type difficulties, or are we talking about things in a broader context here?
Dyslexic.
Okay. So, first of all, those difficulties are not going to necessarily flag themselves up till your child is about 5 years old and
Yeah.
has kind of transitioned from kindergarten into year one. And if you feel that they are not, it's not necessarily just the parent observing a child not knowing their letters. One of the very common things that you start seeing at the beginning of grade one or year one is very big, unusual emotional responses to
Mm.
academic based tasks. The child is otherwise lovely, perfect, so sweet, but as soon as you bring out the letters, the big emotions around.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that is another thing that kind of raises that, I won't say a red flag. I would say that this is an indicator that we need to shift our attention onto this thing.
It's very interesting, Zara, because I do know a lot of kids, and it's actually maybe it's the fact that, devices are becoming more common even in schools, in classrooms now, but the stamina for reading has significantly reduced for kids. So if you
Mm,
ask them to read a page or two page, it's exhausting for them. It's like
mm.
it's really demanding. Now these kids have to sit for tests as well, for exams as well, where there's a lot of reading, where there's a lot of writing to do. Now with that stamina having gone down, one would say that, oh my God, is it dyslexia? Because he does most of these kids also exhibit poor comprehension skills,
Mm.
listening skills, like you just pointed out. So that, I think that makes it even more challenging, right, for people to recognize these signs, that could there be signs of dyslexia, because it just takes so much out of them to read.
There's going to be a very significant and marked, noticeable difference between a child who is on somewhere on a dyslexic spectrum and a child who's just generally struggling with academics. So, when I say the dyslexic spectrum, I mean that again, it depends on the child's risk factors. So, here's a child, let's say at this end of the dyslexic spectrum, there's a child who has, say, a higher full scale IQ. There is no dyslexia in the family, and this child never had any speech and language developmental issues when they were growing up. Now, this child may be someone who may not clinically qualify for a dyslexia diagnosis, but will benefit from having a little bit of additional help in the early years.
Yeah.
Versus a child who's at this end, let's say dad and granddad and cousins are all dyslexic.
Mm,
This child had a double tongue tie when they were growing up. They had significant problems producing sound. Uh, this child's genetic dice is already loaded.
mm, yeah.
So that's your dyslexic spectrum. Now,
Okay.
dyslexia by definition is an unusual and unexpected failure to acquire literacy skills, which means that all of the other skills are developing perhaps on this line, which is slightly
Mm,
between average and above average. But the
right.
literacy skills are down here. When we say
Mm,
a dyslexic profile, we say it's a spiky
noticeable.
profile.
Yeah, it's quite
There are
noticeable.
significant areas of strength, and there is one particular area which is like down here. That's your dyslexic profile.
Okay, so once parents do get their diagnosis, how can they work with schools, with with the child's class teacher to help their child?
I think this is one of my big bugbears. Having a formal identification of dyslexia, no matter where you are, no matter where you live, it is still a privilege.
Okay.
Here in this country, it is being gate kept by assessments,
Mm,
neurodevelopmental assessments that are very expensive.
that's true. Yeah.
Like, how many families can fork over 5,000, 10,000, even more
Yeah.
to have their child formally assessed?
Yeah.
In other countries, most often these services, these identifications are gate kept behind either long waiting list or your postcode or what your district's provisions are looking like. So provision, intervention, and help should not be something which is subjective upon having an identification.
Oh, lovely. Thank you for saying that, Zara. That is something I can't shout and scream out enough. You'll have to say that again. I love it. Thank you so much for saying that out loud.
No, it's and also one of the things as an assessor, one of the things that I'm looking for is a indicator called response to intervention. If a child in year one and in year two has been struggling to acquire
Mhm.
literacy, what intervention have they been given by their school, and what has the response to that intervention been? Because a lot of children struggle to acquire literacy. They're taken out into small booster groups for their phonics.
Yeah.
Parents might put them on a literacy app like Nessie. They might get a
Yes.
tutor for them. If
Yes.
after 18 months of that gap is still not closing, that means that there's something else going on.
What has your experience been like? Like, what could it usually be?
So that is when we start digging deeper and we start exploring whether this child is dyslexic.
Oh, or something else.
So what comes first is the intervention, not the
And
assessment.
oh, okay, okay. That's interesting because this, and like what you rightly pointed out, Zara, not every family can go out there and pay 5,000, 6,000 dirhams for an assessment. And it can be more. But most parents usually do know where the child's challenges are. Even schools know. Even most teachers also know.
Yes.
But then there is, like you exactly said, right? They'll only provide help if there is an assessment sitting there. Even after you tell them, I know exactly what my child needs, maybe just try
Hmm.
that and see where we can go from there. No, we need the assessment first, because then that'll be shared with all the other teachers. It'll help
Hmm.
us be on one page. I've heard that so many times, and parents get disheartened because it doesn't stop with just one assessment. It usually opens the doors to identification of other problems. That
Yes.
can be really expensive, that road to take.
So,
Mm,
why is it can be really expensive? It is also extremely, extremely important because dyslexia is an intensely comorbid occurrence, which means that in my decades of doing what I do, I have never met a child who is only dyslexic. So dyslexia comes as part of a package. Now, the most important, the most visible thing in the primary years might only be the difficulty in acquiring literacy. But there might be a whole range of other things which, if not taken care of, even a very good literacy intervention is not going to work. So, as an example, I was talking about the ATNR not being integrated. If the
mm,
child does not have sensory integration therapy, no matter how much I work with them and no matter how much the parents and the child themselves try, till the ATNR is not integrated, they will not cross the midline, they will not read fluent.
that's true. And I think it's not just for dyslexia, it's for many conditions. They don't exist by themselves. I mean, that's how the body is. If one thing is affected, something else somewhere is affected as well. So, what do you suggest, Zara, for a family who knows that their child has significant reading challenges, doesn't have an assessment yet, but they can see the signs? What do you think they can do at home straight away to start with supporting their child, given the fact that most of these children, like you said, have emotional regulation issues as well? They're perfect kids outside the academic demands. And once they're put on the table, all the emotional challenges come up. So, given that we have that information, how can families support kids at home?
So, there are two things over here, and it might not be something that perhaps a lot of people actually want to hear, but this is, one of the harder truths. If we do not close those reading gaps by the time a child is 8 or 9 years old, what science and what data show us is that those reading gaps will never ever close completely.
Ooh,
So,
wow.
with reading, with literacy skills, the window of opportunity that we have to completely close reading gaps, it's actually very, very small.
Really? That's
So,
news
you
to
really
me.
want to bring out your biggest guns and throw pretty much everything at it. Because if you can tackle it before the child is like 9 years old, wonderful. And I'm talking about the bigger gaps. Because the data, the science that we have now shows us that those, when they start diverging, the two developmental pathways, they just keep on going like this. So you
After the
don't
age
want
of,
to leave it till they are like, yes. You don't
okay.
want to leave it. You have to keep in mind that after year three, after the time, the year three would be like what, 10 years, 11 years old. You're no
Yes.
longer learning to read, you're reading to learn.
Yeah, yes.
There's a huge shift that happens. So if you are still learning to read when you're in year three, year four, then your access to the curriculum is very limited compared to that of your peers. So that's the first thing.
Okay.
How can you support your child at home is linked to the second thing that I wanted to say. It was advice that was given to me many, many years ago. I would say about 12, 13 years ago. A very well meaning nursery leader told me, make a choice now. You can either be your son's therapist or you can be your son's mother. Because
Mm,
given his demand avoidance, given his autism, making him do anything led to a lot of emotion. And I
yeah.
made the choice then that I'm not going to be his therapist. I'm just going to be the safe space. I'm going to be mom. I'm going to be the fun person. And
Yeah.
I will pay other people to work with my kids. So that was a choice that we made as a family that we're not doing this. Not that we're
Mhm.
not capable, it's just we don't want to.
It's emotionally and mentally demanding to be
Yes,
with your.
incredibly. It's draining. And so you could either go for tutoring, additional tutoring. I would say before you go for additional tutoring and you start spending time, money, and emotional resources on that, speak with the school if they can start supporting your child with before school and after school, any kind of booster clubs, the moment you start noticing those gaps appearing. And then luckily, we now have incredibly good app-based support for things like dyslexia and early literacy learning. The evidence-based ones are Nessie.
Nessie, okay.
There's an entire suite of Nessie apps. There's Nessie spelling and Nessie typing and Nessie phonics, Nessie high frequency words, and they're very, very affordable. I think it's like 10 dirhams for one app or something.
Do you have a couple of names? I can probably add them in the show notes.
Yes. So I would say Nessie would be my number one.
Okay.
But it's not going to be my number one because they're both very, very good. I'll give you three. So Nessie, the second one, Teach Your Monster to Read.
Okay.
And the third one, which is also incredibly, incredibly effective, and if it's an app-based literacy program, it's called reading.com.
Oh yeah, okay, I know that one. Okay, these are your top three.
These are my, yes, not in any order. They're all three of them are really, really good.
Hey, that's awesome. You know what, Zara, I always have this, I feel that, the minute we say that, how can we provide accommodations to our children, it's just the language that we use, unfortunately. It works more so against our children than it does anything for them. Because when you use the word accommodation, it's how their peers look at it as well, that, you are in another group, you need help, additional help. And I know this is a bit off topic, but I know that when my son was in mainstream school, he needed his visual schedules. Main one being how his day is going to look like. Now, the other kids in his class, he was in, this is in FS1. Yeah, FS1 all the way till grade 1. He needed his visual schedule. All the children around him really liked looking at his visual schedule. It looked exactly like what's on the board for all of them, right? But they all loved that. And so what the class teacher ended up doing is giving everyone a visual schedule. So she just had a huge visual schedule on the board for everyone to follow. So similarly, I believe, reading difficulty is something which is becoming quite common. I'm not saying that there are a lot of dyslexic kids now, but reading difficulties is becoming a common thing. Now I hear that a lot. And don't you think, or in your opinion, what are the things that schools can take on that would just generally help all kids, whether they're neurotypicals with, who are experiencing challenges with reading? Like, what is something that a class teacher can take on and say, hey, this is going to benefit everyone, not just, an accommodation for a couple of children?
Universal design for learning. What you just described, that's the universality, right? You take a visual schedule. Sorry, I'm borrowing your example. You take a visual schedule. The children who are in your classroom who have anxiety around transitions are going to exceedingly, excessively benefit from having that visual schedule because it will take away the anxiety of what is coming next. But it is something which would benefit the entire classroom as well. So that's universal design. You create something for one group of people, a small group of people with neurodivergence, with a disability, but it benefits everyone. The idea of this comes from design, actually, curb cuts. So you know how a curb has a cut in it to allow seamless access. Now, those were originally designed back in the 1970s for wheelchair users so that they could access the curb seamlessly from the road, a curb cut.
Yeah.
But if you think about the universality of the design there, a curb cut is going to benefit a parent pushing a pram.
Exactly. Yeah.
Me pushing my grocery trolley.
Yeah, it allows me to cycle around as well. Use my cycle.
Exactly. Yeah. A delivery guy pulling a heavy load. So that's universal design. Now, what universal design could look like in inclusive education are things like a visual schedule. If you're looking specifically at literacy, then we have got incredible phonics programs, whole school. You know how children are back in the day, they used to be taught jolly phonics.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm going to see. Excuse me. So there's jolly phonics, then there was read, write, ink, all of these synthetic phonics programs,
Mhm.
synthetic phonics are much, much, much better at giving those children who have literacy difficulties a chance at acquiring reading skills than what is a balanced literacy approach.
Okay. Can you dig in further over there? Like,
Yeah,
what do you mean
I
by
will.
that?
I will.
Example. Yeah.
So, the way this is all right in North America, and I think up until now this is pretty much the case. Fontas and Pinnell was the main program used everywhere. FNP.
Yeah. Yeah.
And FNP used something called a three queuing system to teach a child how to read. Look at the picture. So, if they're very young, if they're 3 years old, the word would be yellow and there would be a yellow splodge
Yeah.
there,
Launch. Yeah.
right? So look at the picture.
Mm.
Look at the first letter. The first letter is Y. So the first letter is Y, and you have a yellow splodge and the context. So if you're reading about chicks or the sun, you know that this string of letters is yellow.
Mm. Right.
Okay, so this was the three queuing system, and this is how a very, very big generation of children were taught how to read. And because
Yeah.
of this system, reading failure rates in the US are at a record high. They're higher than they have ever been.
Really?
So what it's really, really shocking data. When I lecture teachers, I show them this data because I want them to know that this is not a failure of your teaching practice. This is actually a failure of curriculum design. So teachers can only teach with the tools that they've been given. If they
Exactly.
have been given tools that are based on flawed science, they can't teach. Now,
Okay.
two-thirds of 8-year-olds in the US are currently failing at reading. Now, does that mean that two-thirds of those children are dyslexic? No, absolutely not. That's a failure of the curriculum. So when we leave behind the three queuing system, we leave behind balanced literacy and we move towards structured literacy. We see
Okay.
those numbers completely flip around. And structured literacy is this, what you see in this room. It's not rocket science. It's simply A says A. So not teaching children A, B, C, D, E, F. Going at A.
Mm.
The sound. Mapping the sound to the letter. That's structured literacy. That's synthetic phonics.
Authentic. That's what I was going to ask. Okay.
So when systems move from balanced to structured literacy, when we move towards synthetic phonics, reading failure reduces. And then we see with quality fast teaching, then when we see children failing to acquire age and grade appropriate literacy skills, that's when we start asking questions about neurodivergence.
Right. I was listening to another podcast, and it was quite interesting how they included movement in teaching literacy as well, like phonics. Like, so they use their body to form shapes to learn, and they found that was also quite effective. So now, if you have a situation where you have a child on the spectrum and who's also dyslexic, how does a session look like for you? Like, what does a typical session look like for you?
So if I have a child who's autistic and also dyslexic,
I'm curious.
the thing is, it really, really depends on the needs of the child. So I have some children who are autistic and dyslexic, and their autistic needs simply do not come. It's always about which need is the bigger barrier.
Yeah.
So are there autistic traits the greater barrier to learning? Then those need to be addressed first. So we lower those barriers. We lower those barriers so that we can start addressing the dyslexic barriers. Now, I have an autistic child right now whose autistic barriers are very significant. To allow this child to access the literacy, we have a whole raft of visuals and timers. So this is what we're doing now. This is what we're doing next. And then you're going to have your choose time. So very, very clear-cut expectations. This will take us 3 steps, and these 3 steps are expected to be done in this amount of time. If they have this thing of, I want to go to the toilet just to get away from having, give them, I really believe, like I've done it with my kids, I give them the responsibility of I'm still their co-regulating partner, but I give them the responsibility of using me as their co-regulating partner. So if you are leaving the room again and again to go to the toilet because you don't want to do the landing, I might give you 3 toilet tokens.
3 toilet
It's not because I'm being cruel and I don't want you to go to the toilet, but I know that you don't physically need to. So here are your 3 toilet tokens at the beginning of the lesson. You decide when you want to use them.
That's nice.
But then equally, I've got autistic kids, ADHD kids, whose those traits of their neurodiversity are not acting as a barrier to their learning when we get down to the learning. So we can just start addressing the dyslexic aspect of things.
Right. No, I love the idea with the token thing, the toilet token thing, because that allows the child not only to take responsibility, it develops a lot of their own thinking skills about, how can we plan our breaks rather than being,
Yes.
told.
But
Exactly.
I have to add to that, and it didn't happen at the get-go. A lot of trust had to be established fast.
Yeah.
We call it the therapeutic alliance.
Oh, there's a word for it, therapeutic alliance. I didn't know.
Yes. Particularly when you're working with the autistic population, I really need to have that therapeutic alliance with them. I mean, they genuinely have to, they don't have to like me. They have to trust me.
Trust me. Yeah.
They have to trust me and they have to accept me that I might be here to do things with you that you really dislike and they give you a lot of anxiety. But we're in this together and I believe in you, but you just have to give me enough trust to kind of metaphorically hold your hand through this process.
Yeah, and it's not something which, unlike a lot of ABA therapists, what they tend to do is just work on it in the beginning, initially, and then they just phase it out, and then it's all just demand based. It's not supposed to be that way. It's an ongoing process. So you continuously have to keep reminding them through your actions that you can, there's still a trust factor here. Yeah. It's not just something that you do in the beginning and then you just start with, okay, I'm going to place demands. So wonderful. Thank you so much for this, Zara. Wow, I've learned a lot today. And
okay, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, where can people find you if they want to get in touch with you?
Okay, so you can find me here at the TDCC in Dubai. That's where I am, and I also have an Instagram. I'm not super active on there, but yeah, you will find me on Instagram as well.
Lovely. Thank you so much for being with me today.
You are most welcome. It's been a pleasure.